I'm going to call to order the Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee. This is our regularly scheduled meeting. I'm chair of the committee, Councilmember Cam Gordon, and I'm joined today by Council Members Jacob Fry, Lisa Bender, Elizabeth Glidden. I'm expecting Councilmember Alondra Cano to arrive soon, and I know that Councilmember Andrew Johnson won't be joining us today because he had a flight delay coming back from out of town. But 4 of us are a quorum of the committee, so we can conduct our business. We have 5 items before us today. We have 3 consent items and 2 discussion items. I'll read through the consent items, and if any committee member wants to pull something off for discussion, we can certainly do that. The first item is just referring back from the City Council. They referred to us, a staff direction to the Health Department to request up to $100,000 in 2016 rollover funds. I'm going to refer that to staff. The second item is approving the Nicollet Island East Bank NRP Phase 2 Neighborhood Action Plan. And the third item is approving the West Calhoun NRP Phase 2 Action Plan. We are also, our fourth item is going to be just a little discussion about how the historic moment this is, because these are the last 2 NRP plans to be approved by the council if they're approved. And so we'll have a little opportunity to discuss the history of the NRP program in general and maybe some highlights from these action plans. But right now, I'd just like to move the 3 consent items forward for approval. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Those are passed then. Then we'll move on to our 4th item, which is our final neighborhood revitalization program Phase 2 action plans. And we'll hear some highlights of the key elements of the NRP through its long history. And I think Mr. Rubador is going to lead us off on this. Welcome.
Chair Gordon and committee members, good afternoon. I'm David Rubador, Director of the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department with the City of Minneapolis. And I'm pleased to present to you today just a brief presentation on a major benchmark that's being achieved with your action today, in that the last 2 of the Phase 2 plans for the NRP program are moving through the council process for final approval. This item is being presented to you for informational purposes today, and it's a receive and file, so there's no action that's being requested. We thought this is a very significant event. NRP has been a program that's been around that was originally created in 1989 through some action by the state of Minnesota Legislature as well as the city of Minneapolis. And so the first neighborhoods that went into the NRP program started in 1991. So it's been 26 years in the making of activity and funding for supporting our neighborhood organizations in the city. So today really is marking the time when all of the plans now have not only gone into Phase 1, but now they're entering the final and second phase of the program. Regarding that, I just wanted to highlight some kind of important information around the program. As many of you know, the program was funded through the Common Project TIF District, and with an original promise of $20 million per year. The program was started at a time when Minneapolis was really facing some serious issues around disinvestment, crime, and basically some real serious housing crises. The program by design was required to have 52.5% of the money spent on housing. As the program continued to develop and move over time, some changes in state law and the TIF law actually reduced that total contribution to the program down by about $100 million from the original promise, but still a very, very significant investment by the city of Minneapolis into supporting community-based planning and our neighborhood organizations in the city. In 1991, as I mentioned, the first neighborhood went into the program. And in 2012 is when the NCR department actually took over responsibility of the program and the administration and the management of it. The program was broken into 2 phases. Oh, one other thing I should mention before I move on, sorry, my apologies, as I look through my notes. One other thing to note around the NRP program, this was really a very innovative program, as I mentioned, the history of which it came from. But NRP is unique in its approach and application really with compared to other cities around the country. No other city has invested the level of money and the level of resources into their neighborhood organizations like the city of Minneapolis has, as well as the NRP program basically requires all areas of the city where there are residents living are covered by the program. There's a few neighborhoods in the city that are industrial based where nobody lives that aren't actually covered by it. And I should also mention the University District where it has never self-organized, but the rest of the city, every neighborhood in the city actually participates in the program. Oops. Again, the program was broken into two phases. The first neighborhood came in July of 1992, which is Whittier, and they're actually here today with us. They were the first neighborhood in. The final plan of phase 2 was Cedar Riverside in 2007. And phase 2 started around December of 2004 with 3 neighborhoods going in. And as of today, today will be the marking of the final 2 plans going into phase 2. So all neighborhoods are now into phase 2. A chart here just to highlight the activity around the phase 2 planning and when they were approved. As you can see, many of the neighborhoods moved into the phase 1 pretty much beginning in the early 1990s, but really in earnest from about 1995 through the end of the 1990s. I should note that under the NRP program, neighborhoods did not all enter the program at the same time. Initially, there was a lottery system that was in place, and neighborhoods came in on various time periods or various schedules in order to really help manage and cash flow the program. So there was a bit of a timing change or difference between when neighborhoods came in. You can see on this chart also when the phase 2 really took off. Again, the first plans came in 2004, but really the majority of neighborhoods came in the mid-2000s and then another spike around 2011. Entry into phase 2 was a little bit more dependent on when neighborhoods were substantially completed with phase 1 before they could go into phase 2. So that was a little bit more based on activity that neighborhoods were doing, as well as when they actually entered into the first phase. The second chart that I have here really highlights the amount of money that was committed and allocated through the 2 plans. As I mentioned, phase 1 had was part of the original commitment of $400 million over a course of 20 years. There's a lot more money in phase 1, and you can see on the dollar amounts that really spiked in 1995 as a lot of plans were approved, but there was quite a bit of activity that was still occurring during that time period. In phase 2, you can see the dollar amounts are considerably less. Again, with that change in the TIF law at the state, the revenues collected off of the Common Project District was considerably lower, but at the same time, you can see how that spread out over time. We also wanted to take an opportunity to really highlight where money has been allocated over the course of the program for the last 26 years. In phase 1, you can see this is a breakdown basically of the plan allocations. The largest amount, actually over 50%, 53.5% to be exact, is in the area of housing. The next largest area is economic development, and I believe the largest area after that is parks and recreation. This is really important because neighborhoods have spent a great deal of time investing money into the housing stock of the city. And this includes everything from down payment assistance programs to help first-time buyers move into housing. It has included home fix-up programs to help upgrade and improve the city's housing stock. It's included removal of blighted housing where there happened to be a house that was in very bad shape that needed to be demolished, and partnering with the city in order to have that done. It included helping to fund the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund. And it also included a lot of education programs around renters forums, home buyer education for new buyers moving into buying their first home. And then during the foreclosure crisis, actually funding foreclosure prevention programs to help people actually stay in their houses and not lose it. It should also be noted that in addition to the economic development, that the neighborhoods did a considerable amount of investment partnering with the Parks Board in doing improvements to the city's parks. That includes physical improvements to the buildings as well as the spaces, the program spaces, but also included a lot of programs for youth and other types of activities. Phase 2 allocations, again, the dollar amounts in phase 2 are considerably lower, but in phase 2 allocations, you can see the portion of money that was dedicated to housing, or that is dedicated because a lot of this activity is still underway, is actually considerably larger. It's now up to 78, almost 79%. And so it makes up the vast majority of the work that neighborhoods are investing their NRP money into today. Just at the conclusion here, I just wanted to highlight there's lots of different activities that are listed on here. Just a summary of there's many projects that have gone on around the city that have been significantly either supported by or affected by the NRP Phase 1 and Phase 2 work. Everything from the Mercado down on Bloomington and Lake to, as I mentioned, parks improvements, the global market, the Whittier School, among many others. So this is just a kind of a quick summary list to give you some ideas of where neighborhoods have invested money over time. So with that, we just wanted the opportunity to really highlight this very significant benchmark that now we have entered into the final phase of NRP. Didn't want that to pass without really kind of making note of the program and the highlights from it. And so with that, Chair Gordon, that concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I did want to mention to make it clear that I think one of the reasons why so much of the money was going towards housing was because that was a requirement of the program. And I believe between the first phase and the second phase, actually, in order to maybe correct for some flexibility in the first phase, where not enough money was invested in housing, there was an expectation that neighborhood would invest up to 70% in the second phase.
To Chair Gordon and committee members, that is correct. The state law requires 52.5% of all the NRP funds be invested into some type of housing activity. In Phase 1, we were pretty close, but a little bit short of that. So in Phase 2, with the lower dollar amounts, that percentage had to be bumped up to a 70% requirement. And as you can see on the chart, we're actually at 78%. And so we're exceeding that expectation at this point. But yes, by law, 52.5% through the duration of the program needs to go to housing.
Well, I appreciate that. I think this is a significant day, so I appreciate that we took some time to do a further review and dig into it a little bit. I think there's lots more information that's waiting there based in all the action plans. It's actually a great place to go back and look at what were people concerned about, even over time in the neighborhoods. So I appreciate that report. I think we get to talk a little bit more maybe about NRP with our next item. This is kind of a neighborhood revitalization program meeting. So I'll just move to receive and file this report. And seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? I think that's at least 3 ayes. Okay, it's unanimous. That passes. I won't even ask for the noes. Also, I'll acknowledge that we're joined today by Councilmember Reich. Appreciate you coming today and listening in, and also appreciate the fact that Councilmember Reich worked with me on the next item that's coming up, which has to do with restoring Phase 2 NRP funds to approved NRP neighborhood action plans. This is something actually that Councilmember Reich and also the Council President and I were talking about for several months now, and we're bringing it forward. And I'll welcome Mr. Rubador for a presentation on this too. There's 2 actions here. One is authorizing Finance and Property Services and NCR departments to allow neighborhood organizations to contract up to $100,000 of their approved NRP Phase 2 allocations, and that's inclusive of the 2012 CPP equity funds. There's and according to a schedule that's attached. There's also a resolution that we'll be passing. The staff report reflects an inaccurate number because what we're talking about is this year's funding, but if you look at the resolution in your packet, that has the correct number. And I'll let Mr. Rubador go through some of the details.
Chair Gordon and committee members, again, thank you. And I'm David Rubador, Director of the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department with the City of Minneapolis. And I'm very pleased to be before you today to talk about repayment of the Phase 2 NRP funds. In this presentation, there's going to be a couple of us that will be doing this presentation. It is a bit of a complicated proposal before you, but a very important one at that, and we want to make sure that we have the right subject matter experts available to be able to present it and answer questions. I am going to start off with really giving you an overview as to why we're here basically and what the condition is that brought us here. And then Robert Thompson is going to get up and talk about the impact of the proposal before you And then we also do have Mark Winkelhank from the Finance Department to be able to talk about, and also Bob Cooper, I should say, from the Finance Department to talk about any questions regarding the funding mechanism that is being discussed today. So we have a number of people here, and hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions as we move through. As Chair Gordon had mentioned, there's two requests being put before you today. First is authorizing finance and property services and the NCR departments to allow neighborhood organizations to contract up to 100% of their approved NRP Phase 2 allocations, inclusive of the 2012 CPP equity funds according to the recapitalization schedule included in the RCA. And I'll talk about those equity funds in a minute to be able to explain that. The second request is the passage of the resolution that authorizes a transfer of $3,390,597 in 2017 from the Consolidated TIF District to the NRP fund, which is 01 CNR. In the RCA, it actually states the full amount, which is the $9,141,951. The resolution is correct in that today's action would authorize the passage of, or the transfer of the $3,390,597. The additional amounts will be handled through the regular budget process in the future. So just give you some background, I'm going to give you some a little context as to where this came from and why this request is before you today. This is a little bit of the information that we already talked about in the last presentation, but I'll just touch on it briefly. So the NRP was authorized by the state statute and began resident-based planning back in 1991. The original commitment was $404 million over the course of 20 years, and then those funds would be allocated in two phases from 1990 through basically 2009. The capitalization of the program would go through 2009, and basically neighborhoods would be able to spend those monies based on approved plans that go through the NRP Policy Board and the City Council. In 2010, in an effort to really respond to citizens concerned about increasing property taxes in the city, the council took a budget action that basically reduced the size of the Consolidated TIF District for 2 years. That action actually resulted in a $10 million basically savings, we stopped collecting $10 million off the Consolidated TIF for 2 years, but we took $10 million out of the NRP Phase 2 program and moved it into what was the Community Participation Program, which was the ongoing funding stream for neighborhoods. So basically what happened was, just to explain it a little bit in a little different way, the CPP program was moving out about $5 million a year for the NCR department and neighborhoods. So if we stopped collecting revenue off the TIF for 2 years, that was a $10 million basically drop in revenue. We shifted money from one program into the other and basically took it out of the NRP Phase 2. The result of that was that the specific action that the council took was to request or to have direct staff to, in essence, freeze neighborhoods at 50% of their NRP Phase 2 funding allocation as a way to capture the $10 million. The reality of it was, at the time, neighborhoods were in various stages of NRP Phase 2. As I mentioned earlier, neighborhoods went into the program at varying times, spent money at varying different levels. And so the impact of that action was disproportionate, or was inconsistent from one neighborhood to the next. Some neighborhoods got froze at 50% and basically lost half of their Phase 2 allocations, while some neighborhoods were already done with Phase 2 and basically lost no money. So it went anywhere from 50% to no loss of funds. But also at the same time, the council actually, through that action, had in essence captured $12.68 million, more than what was needed in order to fund the $10 million. So subsequent actions that the council took, one was to refund basically $2.6 million of that original budget action and then allocate that back to neighborhood organizations. So that was done in 2011. And then also council asked staff to look for ways in order to try to repay the additional $10 million wherever we could find. And at that time, through some kind of looking at the Consolidated TIF and what we could expect in revenues coming off of that, we were able to actually release another $858,000 back to neighborhoods in what was called equity funds, which was given to the neighborhoods that lost the most amount of money. So it went from, we were able to bring neighborhoods from a 50% reduction to bringing them up to 70% of their phase 2 allocation. So as a result of these two actions by the council later, neighborhoods had anywhere from 70% of their phase 2 allocations to 100% depending on where they were in phase 2. Again, the result of this really hit the city and the neighborhoods of the city very differently, again, because many of the neighborhoods were in very different places. What you see on the map here is where the money actually, who lost the most amount of money. And you can see there's really no pattern in the city other than there is a concentration in the North Minneapolis neighborhoods of Jordan, Hawthorne, and the near north, as well as Willard Hay, were some of the neighborhoods that lost the most amount of money, as well as Longfellow and the area in the South Minneapolis, Neenah and Field Regina, as well as downtown. So again, it's kind of all over the city. But basically, every ward of the city, every planning district of the city had a varying impact by this, and that some neighborhoods lost a significant amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, while others lost none. At that time, the council, again, as I mentioned, asked us to continue to look for ways to basically make the program whole again if the opportunity were to arise. And so what we have before you today is a presentation to restore this funding from this action back in 2010. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert Thompson to talk about the proposal to repay the funds.
Great. Chair Gordon, committee members, thank you. I'm Robert Thompson with the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department, and I'm just going to walk through a little bit about the repayment of the dollars, where that'll be going and what it'll be used for. As we talked about, a lot of neighborhoods in 2010 with the original action, subsequent actions, lost varying dollar amounts. But what I want to point out is there were still neighborhoods across the city in every ward that were impacted by these dollars. Holland from $205,000 to near North Willard Hay, which lost over $500,000 through that action, or Longfellow, $691,000 that was frozen, that will be repaid through these actions. So we in total actually have 66 phase 2 plans that would have some level of funds that would be restored through this action today. And where these dollars are going, it's not just going out generally to neighborhoods. Actually, again, these dollars will be restored to these phase 2 plans, and these phase 2 plans have obligated these dollars to a variety of strategies. As David was pointing out earlier, the majority of dollars was for neighborhood housing programs, actually. And so looking at this slide here, I did some analysis over the weekend. Just shy of $7 million out of this will be going into neighborhood housing programs. And just to give you an example of some of these kinds of housing programs, for example, Hawthorne, which had a significant amount of frozen dollars, they have phase 2 strategies where they have dollars would be available through this for constructing new single-family homes, major housing developments, a substantial amount in a rehab loan program for neighborhood residents. Longfellow neighborhood has fundings about $450,000 in their phase 2 plan would become available for housing development incentives. Nokomis East also had a significant amount of funds frozen, and they have money that could be set aside for home improvement loan programs that they could get those going. Some other examples too, that we have, Holland and some other neighborhoods have money set aside for home buyer assistance. That's been a real important issue for a lot of neighborhoods. We've talked about, for example, renters. This has been a real important program for helping renters become homeowners in their neighborhoods. And a lot of neighborhoods have had these down payment assistance programs. So we'll have funding going back into, these are real housing programs, not just housing in the abstract. A lot of neighborhoods also have programs for economic development is the second highest total of where funds would be available. So we have some programs, for example, for commercial revitalization, commercial small storefronts, for example, commercial paint and fix revolving loan programs, clean and green programs, and revolving loan funds to help businesses out. So some exciting programs through these phase 2 strategies for economic development as well. And as always, neighborhoods have also invested in a lot of other areas, environmental programs, plan coordination, of course, implementing the plans is a real important component of neighborhood activity, a lot of crime and safety initiatives that neighborhoods invest in, et cetera. So these are going back into real programs and not just going back into, to neighborhoods. And again, as David was pointing out, some of the city's most diverse neighborhoods too will be impacted by this. Near North Willard Hay, for example, will have about a little over $500,000 repaid that'll be freed up for, again, housing programs and commercial development programs. Holland, $205,000, Hawthorne neighborhood, $478,000. One I don't have on the list here, but Nokomis East, about $790,000. So a lot of money that'll be going back into these neighborhood funds for these activities. And I think at this point, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Mark, if I could have you talk about the repayment schedule and also the financing process. So if I could have Mark McCulloch from Finance and Property Services.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, council members. As sort of outlined in the RCA, the main funding source, or the only funding source at this moment for the repayment of these funds, is from the Consolidated TIF District. And I'll give you just a little bit of background on that, so some of you are familiar with that district and others perhaps are not, but this is the city's largest TIF district. It was established back in 2009 through special legislation that we received at the state. The city began collecting increment in 2011. It's got a maximum 10-year life, so 2020 is the last